markets and products of Semburo. Is expert of the high-level expert group for the review of the European Standardization System Express. Is chairman of the working group Statistical Control of Concrete of the Association of Concrete of Spain. Is author of the technical recommendations, including in the instruction of the Spanish Instruction for Concrete. Is expert in ultimate limit state of buckling and method of design in concrete. Is also speaker of the Guía of the Application of the Instruction of Concrete Structures. Professor at the University of Madrid, and is also author of several books and publications. Juan Carlos, when you wish.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to give this presentation. Although hearing the previous speaker, Carlos, speaking so well and so excellent about many items and many subjects I will expose, I think that a lot of my presentation could be summarized because Carlos has given a lot of data very useful in this context. So I will try to recover a lot of time in my presentation. Okay, this slide is for me very interesting. I was afraid when Carlos commenced giving data, for such data were incoherent with my data. It is not the case. You can see in the slide that many of the data given by Carlos coincide with my data. And in this perspective, a very important reflection is to be given down. We, as you can read here, spend 90% of our lives in a building. Very important figure that, in fact, operates and runs many of the missions we will give about. In Europe, more or less, 42% of energy consumption and 35% of emissions of greenhouse gases are due to buildings. That coincides with your main figures. And the recast of the European Directive on Energy Efficiency, the Energy Performance of Building Directive, EPBD, estimated to save between 160 to 100 million tons of CO2 per year. More or less, imagine that this, in the case of buildings, would represent more or less the total emissions of the materials used in the constructions. So imagine the potential savings in this subject. And the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Initiative Working Group of the United Nations Environment Programme estimates that the energy consumption of buildings can be reduced, again we coincide, 30%, 35%, without, very important, increasing investment costs. If we imagine a usual building with more or less 60 years of service life, that represents that the 80–90% of CO2 emissions is due to the use of buildings. The more or less 10% of CO2 emissions is due to the embodied CO2 of materials. Imagine the difference between them. I can give you an example of figures underlining the difference to potential savings for acting in active, you mentioned, or passive energy efficiency measures. It's incredible, the potential of savings. And many people think that reductions on CO2 emissions of materials productions can enhance a lot this final balance of emission. And you can see of these figures that it's much more useful passive measures or active measures in the in-use phase of the building that could enhance a lot the final balance of these emissions and energy cost. And more or less 2–3% of CO2 is emitted during the construction phase. That's again the idea that the construction phase is not so important and as the in-use phase of these buildings. The occupancy and use of the 160 million buildings in the EU, in Europe, account for this 42% of its energy consumption, and as such, as the largest single source of the region's emission. No other, neither transport, neither materials, and so on. This is the most important emissions, CO2 emissions and other emissions source. So acting in this field is absolutely necessary. And differentiating the potential savings to act properly in its field is also very important at this stage, because potential savings of energy consumption and CO2 emissions are big and very different in all phases of the life cycle of a building. Yeah. It can be summarized in many ways, the previous ideas. One I like is put on the screen in this graph. We have in this graph two kinds of constructions. It's absolutely approximative, not real or actual figures, although they are very approximate. But the difference between lightweight construction and heavyweight construction can be so big that you can consider these figures only approximative. In this axis, we can see the CO2 tons a long time, considering both the CO2 emissions in the construction phase and the CO2 emissions in the in-use phase and demolition and so on phase, the last phase, comparing the two kinds of constructions. That refer mainly to the passive efficiency energy you mentioned before, Carlos. But taking into account this, you can see that we find a payback period of 16 years when the most important and high CO2 emissions due to heavyweight construction are recovered and balanced, and the other period of time until service life end are savings for this kind of construction. So heavyweight construction, bricks, masonry bricks, concrete mainly, are a potential savings of CO2 emissions and energy very important at this stage. Sorry. And therefore, an approach to the life cycle of the building is necessary, because if not, if we see only the previous graph is very important at this stage, the initial consumptions and emissions, we can face properly the actual figures and balance of this very important subject we are treating. So an approach of life cycle is absolutely decisive in this stage. And most important is that the in-use phase is the most important of the two or three phases we can consider a long time in the building. And the possibilities of improvement in terms of efficiency, saving energy, and so on, are very relevant. Carlos, in his excellent presentation, gave us some ideas I promise you to spend, because you have given me some other ideas and additional ideas, very important. But mainly considering only passive measures, how concrete can contribute to the sustainability of housing? Because here we have not a dilemma, because the two possibilities are clear and active measures are important. But we could summarize at this stage the question in two other questions. We can change the behavior of millions of people in relation to its behavior with respect to energy consumption. Of course, other intelligent measures you have mentioned much more important, but people behavior is also important at this stage. Or, on the other hand, we can build or refurbish, very important to existing structures, with the aim of being inherently savers of energy from the first minute of his service life to the end of his service life. These two actions are, of course, of interest, and we are interested to focus the attention of you in the second phase, because we are now talking about material, about concrete, and his positive contribution in this context. And now we are trying to study carefully these other properties of concrete that can enhance his behavior in this field of saving energy and in general in the field of sustainable construction. Taking into account sustainable construction and the three pillars of it, environmental, social and economics, there are a lot of important properties of materials, mainly concrete at this stage and at least in my presentation, that can have a very important effect on this sustainable construction area. We can mention thermal mass, fire safety, acoustic isolation, maintenance, and not only, we have written in these 3 or 4 minutes another very important properties to mention here. For instance, durability, longer service life, less resources consumption implied, recycling and reuse of the material, robustness, a very important property for the future due to the external and extreme chance that the climate change evolution will rise in the future due to this external charge. Concrete structure will be of interest at this stage too. Reliability, accessibility for aged population in Europe, which is increasing. These important properties of materials have to be balanced in these 3 pillars, and you can find in the slide that many of them interact and can be considered in the 3 of pillars, although in many occasions we can focus only each property only in one of these pillars. It is not true, and the majority of properties can be found that act in these 3 pillars. At this stage, as Senate President, I like to give this kind of puzzle or dilemma or mess, because in fact this is a mess. It's like a mess. We have, at this stage, at least the European Commission has a very big problem, and this European Commission has given the first step around the world to demonstrate his very certain voluntary to be active in this subject. Relating sustainable construction, there are a lot of initiatives in Europe that in some cases could be mismatched. And this is important to consider this, because we are now acting so fast in these fields or zones that we need some reflection about these points. Let me tell you that in some cases I don't know the acronyms relating these areas. It's very difficult to move in this way in Europe, because I have a kind of dictionary that explains me in each moment what that exactly means CPR, although CPR is for me very easy, because the Construction Product Directive, which will be moved in a Construction Product Directive regulation very soon. So we have, and you mentioned before, Carlos too, we have incentives to work hardly in this area, regulations, a lot of regulations in Europe, the CEN-TC 350, whose work is very important, the Construction Product Regulation, the Directive on Efficiency Performance of Buildings Directive, many voluntary initiatives, and very soon also standardized the carbon footprint standards, and recycling and sustainable use of natural resources standardized too, on the right side. On the left side, we have incentives to act as industrials in a very proactive way in this area. We have to benefit for the second generation of Eurocodes. We will talk about some things, some ideas about that. We have the declaration of the Commission that the sustainable construction is a lead market when innovation and clear measures of saving energy and so on are absolutely crucial to maintain our competitiveness and our priorities. We have another important area as the GPP, the Green Public Procurement, which offers us a very important area to be proactive as material industries in this area. And, as you have mentioned before, at the end, at the bottom, certification, eco-labels, etc. This is exactly the situation in Europe, and in some sense around the world too. And this is not finished. It's a task not finished, and at this stage many people are concerned about the lot of different things they can think about, the incoherence, mismatchings, and so on between them. Although in 3 or 4 years, and mainly when important standards, like standards made now by the TC 350 are concluded, the scenario will be clearer, and we will have absolutely clear ideas to work. You mentioned before, Carlos, also the regulation in Spain and in other areas. This is another regulation to add to this slide, and it's very important to consider the possible mismatches we can find here. The same approach, very soon. TC 350 is responsible for the development of voluntary or horizontal, not vertical, horizontal standardized methods for the assessment of the sustainability aspect of new, but very important, existing, because we must save energy on existing buildings, which is much more difficult than for new, construction works, and for standards for the environmental declaration of construction product. An important area. Each material must have its environmental product declaration, EDP, when it declares the footprint, other emissions, CO2 embodied, and so on, for users and constructors that must use this material can add for the posterior phases this footprint, CO2 footprint order to the following phases of construction. The standards made in this group will be generally applicable, because they are horizontal for everybody, and relevant for the assessment of integrated performance of buildings, important over its life cycle, and considering the 3 pillars of sustainability. I mentioned before that the TC 350 is working with these 3 pillars, which is the first thing, in my opinion, we do so, and is causing difficulties, although I am sure that these difficulties will be solved. And the standards will describe a harmonized methodology for assessment of environmental cost, economy, and health and safety. This is an idea. I will pass it very soon because I have been mentioned that please don't consider that lightweight structures are, for the sake of being lightweight, more efficient than heavyweight construction. On the contrary, this slide can tell you the message that probably bigger impacts in the initial phase could be balanced with a final impact less than on the other side, building A, when a material, lightweight material is used and the initial impacts are less.
Juan Carlos, 10 minutes.
Okay, so pass immediately this because it's important to tell you some final messages about the material, which is for me very important. I will, in a minute, this is the work done with these premises, scenarios I have mentioned before, the work done in CEN-TC 350, no much important. Interesting for you, in Europe we have for this material the first EDP for cement type 1, and in Spain we have tried to construct partial data, mainly CO2 footprint only, not all emissions, for concrete. We have some data here for the CO2 embodied in concrete, normal concrete, 25 megapascals characteristic strength, or between 25 and 50. We have some data. That is my last reflection, implies for us that if we, as a concrete industry, if we want concrete to be useful in the future, we must emerge for the concrete the properties concrete has always had, but not very well manifested. Concrete have always had a lot of excellent properties, but the specifiers mainly focus in two: compressive strength and long duration structure. But today we have another to emerge for the benefit of buildings in the future. For instance, thermal mass, isolation, robustness, external strength events resistant, very important in the future, reliability, aesthetics, colors, indoor air quality, etc., etc. And these are some samples of these new properties I telling you concrete has. For instance, clean, the possibility that concrete can clean itself with the help of water, for instance, because of photocatalytic principles. For instance, translucent. For instance, lightweight concrete for special structures with light aggregates and high strength instead. For instance, decorative concrete, concrete with pigments. For instance, concrete with treated surface, textured formwork, retardants, and so on. For instance, expressive, because aesthetics for the architects is very important. For instance, luminous, with white cement, a very important feature for future cities, because the potential savings, because of the albedo effect of this aspect of clarity and lightness is very important too. For instance, durable. For instance, fast. Also easy, self-compacting concrete, quality assurance and good finishing. Also secure. So safety is a very important feature of concrete, because concrete doesn't burn and does not add to the fire load. Concrete has high resistance to fire and stops fire spreading. It's an effective fire shield, providing safe measures to escape for occupants and protection for firefighters and so on. It's a very important feature. For instance, comfortable too. Comfort and efficiency joined in saving energy for residents. Thermal mass I have mentioned before, and Carlos too, not necessary. In fact, for today and for the future, concrete in houses is not only strength and durability as was, but it is also acoustic insulation, thermal mass, energy efficiency, compartmentalization and fire resistant, structure and facade. That's to say, comfortable and efficient for user and society. And savings in energy consumption and maintenance are very clear. And of course, as usual, without taking into account that strengths and reliability are also for us in the structures we have. So in this context, promotion of these new properties is for us very important, and we will work very hard for this promotion in the next future, because the new target is sustainability. New requirement, new opportunities, and new social demand. We must act in this direction. Thank you very much for your attention.
For your interesting exposition. And now the last presentation of this plenary session is of Professor Jaime Fernández Gómez of the Spanish Institute